The movie opens with flashes of the Chicago skyline and fight between an unidentified man and Helen Kimble, Celia Ward. In the struggle, Helen is killed when her assailant shoots her with the pistol she and her husband, Dr. Richard Kimble, Harrison Ford, a prominent Chicago vascular surgeon, keep in their bedroom and then crushes part of her head with a heavy piece of decorative stone. A man walks through a room and Richard stands up with scratches on his neck and is escorted out the door. A reporter stands outside, telling the camera what's happened. Kimble climbs into the back of a police car. In the interview room, Richard Kimble, Harrison Ford, sits across from Detective Kelly, Ron Dean, recounting the events leading up to the tragedy. Through flashbacks, we see Richard and his wife Helen attending a glamorous Children's Research Aid Foundation fundraiser. The couple mingles with donors, exchanging smiles and small talk. At one point, Helen is encircled by a group of men, and Richard playfully rescues her, showcasing their bond. During the event, Richard shares a friendly moment with his best friend and colleague, Dr. Charles Nichols, Jeroen Crab, who expresses gratitude for borrowing Richard's car temporarily. Later that evening, as Richard and Helen drive home, he receives an urgent call about an emergency surgery, cutting their evening short. Disappointed but understanding, Helen assures him she'll wait up for him at home. Her voice lingers in Richard's memory as it echoes in the background of the interrogation room, just as another officer enters. The detectives question Richard, asking if anything unusual had happened recently and pressing him about the fight with a man with one arm. Noting that Richard's fingerprints were found on the gun used to kill Helen and that he's the only witness. Convinced of his guilt, they decide to charge him with her murder. Richard is arrested and put on trial. The scene shifts to the courtroom, where he sits listening to the prosecution's opening statement, flashing back to the events of that fateful night. Detective Kelly testifies on the stand, recounting the evidence, while Richard's memories play out in fragments. In his mind, Richard relives coming home from work and walking into his house. He sees Helen struggling to gasp for air as she manages to call 911. The prosecution introduces the 911 call as evidence, and the recording is played in court. Helen's panicked voice is heard saying that someone is in the house trying to kill her. As Richard remembers, he visualizes himself running upstairs. Back in the courtroom, the prosecution continues building its case. Despite Richard's vivid account of the events and his insistence on his innocence, the weight of the evidence against him, Helen's 911 call, his fingerprints on the gun, and a lack of proof of the one-armed man, leads to a devastating outcome. The jury finds him guilty of Helen's murder. Richard is sentenced to death and remanded to the Illinois State Penitentiary, where he awaits execution by lethal injection. Richard is among several convicts shackled and loaded onto a bus for transport to prison. As the bus nears its destination, one of the prisoners stages a dramatic escape attempt by faking a seizure, complete with foaming at the mouth. When an officer approaches to assist, the convict stabs him with a makeshift shiv crafted from a sharpened toothbrush. Chaos erupts as another guard shoots two prisoners with a shotgun. However, when a third prisoner tries to overpower him, the struggle causes an accidental discharge that fatally wounds the driver. The bus veers off the road, tumbling down a hill and coming to a stop on a railroad track. Amid the wreckage, Richard notices that one guard is severely injured. The older guard, still armed, demands Richard's help. In exchange, Richard insists on being freed from his shackles. The guard tosses him the keys, and Richard unlocks his restraints. As Richard struggles to help the wounded guard, the sound of an approaching freight train grows louder. Realizing the imminent danger, Richard quickly frees the remaining survivors, sending it flying and derailing the train. Copeland later returns to briefly free Richard from his chains before disappearing into the night, warning Richard not to follow him. Injured from the crash, Richard stumbles away, seeking shelter and medical attention as he follows the riverbank, determined to survive. The county police and Illinois State Police quickly converge on the crash site to investigate the incident. They are soon joined by a team of U.S. Marshals led by Deputy U.S. Marshal Samuel Gerard, Tommy Lee Jones, and his local police team appear to have the situation under control and are reluctant to relinquish jurisdiction. However, when Biggs discovers a set of leg irons that belong to Richard and are no longer attached to anyone, the realization dawns that a fugitive is on the loose. Gerard asserts his authority and takes over the scene, organizing a large-scale manhunt and dragnet within a 15-mile radius. He orders that every home, business, and hospital in the area be thoroughly searched. Meanwhile, Richard, injured and desperate, stumbles into a clearing beneath a bridge. He manages to steal a workman's coveralls to blend in and makes his way to a nearby hospital for treatment. Back at the crash site, Gerard's team follows a trail of blood, which they suspect belongs to Richard. Acting swiftly, Gerard orders Richard's mugshot to be faxed to every local hospital in case he seeks medical help. The tense atmosphere is briefly interrupted when rescue workers finally free the injured guard who was stabbed during the attempted jailbreak. Richard arrives at the hospital and discreetly steals medical supplies to treat his wound. While stitching himself up, a state trooper arrives at the hospital and informs the medical staff about the escaped prisoner, distributing Richard's mugshot. Meanwhile, Richard slips into a patient's room and steals an elderly man's clothes. When a nurse enters to tend to the patient, Richard quickly hides behind the bathroom door. After she leaves, he shaves off his beard, combs his hair, and even helps himself to the patient's breakfast. As Richard exits the room, he crosses paths with the state trooper in the hallway. The trooper, suspicious of the resemblance, just as Richard is leaving the hospital, an ambulance arrives carrying the injured guard from the train wreck. The guard recognizes Richard as he assists the paramedics with unloading the stretcher. Realizing his cover is blown, Richard seizes the opportunity to steal the ambulance once the paramedics are out of sight. The stolen ambulance report quickly reaches Gerard, prompting the marshals to launch a high-stakes pursuit, closing in on Richard once again. Richard abandons the ambulance near a dam and escapes into a drainage system. While navigating the tunnels, Gerard separates from his team, slipping as he climbs down and losing his pistol. Richard picks up the weapon and points it at Gerard, claiming he didn't kill his wife. Gerard's sharp reply, "I don't care," pushes Richard to flee. Gerard grabs a backup weapon and continues the chase, cornering Richard at a high drainage port. Trapped, Richard defies surrender orders and leaps hundreds of feet into the river below. Gerard's team catches up and assumes Richard couldn't have survived the fall, but Gerard is unconvinced. He orders a search of the river and surrounding woods, deploying dive teams and hounds, despite objections from local law enforcement. Meanwhile, Richard manages to escape through the forest, exhausted and wounded. He collapses, plagued by dreams of his wife, her murder, and the fight with the killer. After waking, he continues his escape and is picked up by a kind stranger on the roadside. In Chicago, Gerard and his team receive a tip that someone matching Richard's description is with a woman in Whiting, Indiana. They launch a raid using various disguises to approach the house. However, instead of Richard, they find Copeland. Richard returns to Chicago, contacting his lawyer, Walter Guthrie. He lies about his location, claiming to be in St. Louis, knowing the marshals are tapping his associates' phones. However, the sound of an L train and a Chicago bridge bell in the background gives away his real location. Realizing the net is tightening, Richard reaches out to his colleague Dr. Charles Nichols, who gives him some cash but is forced to drive away under police pressure. Gerard's team digs into the original investigation, questioning the Chicago detectives who worked the case. Richard rents a basement apartment from an elderly woman and starts investigating the real killer. At Cook County Hospital, disguised as a janitor, he accesses the prosthetics department records and narrows the suspects to 5 individuals with a prosthetic arm. During a chaotic influx of patients from a bus accident, Richard steps in to save a young boy by correcting a misdiagnosis, a decision that catches the attention of ER doctor and Eastman. When she confronts him, Richard is forced to flee just as Gerard arrives, piecing together that Richard is looking for a one-armed man. Gerard and Richard both investigate individuals with prosthetic arms. Richard's search leads him to Frederick Sykes, whose photos reveal he is the man Richard remembers fighting. Richard deduces that his wife's murder was part of a conspiracy to cover up fraudulent medical research. Richard calls Gerard from Sykes' apartment, leaving the line open for a trace. Gerard and his team raid the apartment, finding Richard's fingerprints but no sign of him. When questioned, Sykes denies knowing Richard and provides a shaky alibi. Gerard grows increasingly suspicious and orders further investigation into Sykes' connection to Devlin McGregor and Lentz. Nichols claims ignorance about Lentz's death and denies any involvement. Richard obtains liver samples from the drug trial, discovering they were falsified to make Pervasic appear safe. He confronts Nichols at a hotel presentation, accusing him of orchestrating the murder to silence Richard and protect the drug. Nichols denies the accusations, but a physical fight ensues, spilling onto the roof and through a skylight into the laundry room below. Gerard arrives and assures Richard he knows the truth about the conspiracy. Nichols tries to shoot Gerard but is stopped by Richard, who knocks him unconscious. Richard surrenders, and Gerard, now convinced of his innocence, escorts him out of the hotel. Nichols and Sykes are arrested, and Gerard promises Richard he will be exonerated.